In December 1812, in temperatures of -35°C, the last remnants of Napoleon Bonaparte's once proud Grand Army staggered towards the town of Vilnius, capital of the Baltic state of Lithuania, pursued by Tsar Alexander I's forces. A few weeks later, 40,000 of them were dead, many consigned to a recently discovered mass grave. What was found last year in the pit, the first Napoleonic mass grave ever excavated, has changed forever our understanding of the Grand Army's terrible last days. Long believed to be the victims of avenging Cossacks, the real architect of their destruction was altogether more shocking and surprising. When Lithuania was still part of the Soviet Union, the site of the excavation was a Red Army camp, closed off to the public. But after the Soviets retreated, constructors began digging foundations for apartment blocks and discovered a mass of bones. To the man who will be responsible for examining the bones, the state of the site presents a unique challenge.
There are bones and skeletons on both sides of the trench, and it's evident that in the center they're still not uncovered, and skeletons are very densely packed. They're overlapping, laying one upon each other. So, of course, it will make work rather complicated.
But one thing is already clear. For those in the pit, this was a brutal end.
These are my patients. I try to see them as cases while I'm on the field. But it's evident what a horror they were experiencing on their last days of their death. They were completely exhausted. They were starving. They were freezing. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers who are disorganized and so on, just rushing into the city, expecting for some shelter, some help, and their expectations were not fulfilled. How you would feel in that situation?
Draw a straight line from Paris through Berlin to Moscow, and along it you will find Vilnius, for 2 centuries an epicenter of war. Wars involving Russia, Poland, Sweden, France, and Germany have reached their climax here. In the last century, the Nazis exterminated 99% of Lithuania's Jews, a third of Vilnius's population. Stalin's mass murder of Lithuanian nationalists followed. This country has been one of Europe's bloodiest killing fields. In 1812, Lithuania was on the fault line between 2 great empires. To the east, the Russian Empire, ruled by Alexander I, Lithuania its most westerly state. To the west, Napoleon's vast empire, including Poland. Such was the rivalry between them that only one outcome was possible: war. When the Tsar defied Napoleon's blockade on trade with his arch-enemy Britain, preparations began for war. With a glittering 20 years of military triumph behind him, an empire larger than Julius Caesar's, and a Europe filled with sycophantic monarchies applauding his every move, the Emperor Napoleon believed he could not lose. Today, the Emperor Napoleon's greatest defender is a Russian historian, Oleg Sokolov.
Que l'on dise de vous, évitez dans cette grande bataille, dans le plaine de Moscou. Marchons donc en avant, portons la guerre sur son territoire.
Sokolov organizes Napoleonic battle reconstructions across the globe. Always acting the part of the long-dead emperor, he has committed to memory the explanations Bonaparte provided for his actions just before his death on St. Helena.
Vive l'empereur! Vive l'empereur! Vive l'empereur!
Je n'ai pas envahi la Russie.
I didn't invade Russia. It was the Emperor Alexander I who wanted war. It was he who in 1811 massed Russian troops towards the borders and wanted to go on the offensive, invade Warsaw, rouse up all Germany against me, and then topple the imperial throne. Our aim was to crush the Russian army and impose a peace which could put to an end the disastrous influence that Russia had exerted for 50 years over Europe's affairs.
Napoleon was total master of the whole of Western Europe, except Sweden and England. And he assembled the biggest army that had ever been assembled, certainly the most spectacular army, but he hoped to have a quick victory, and he hoped to defeat the Russians in Lithuania.
I was absolutely sure that the Russians wouldn't retreat, that the battle would be victorious and take place at the end of June or in July. I was sure the campaign would last 20 days.
On June the 21st, Midsummer's Day, 1812, Napoleon crossed over the River Niemen, unopposed, into Lithuania. His grand army, some 500,000 men, Poles, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, Dutch and French, advanced on Vilnius.
It is going to be a military promenade to Petersburg and Moscow. All the glorious stories there will be to tell of it.
The Russians simply avoided battle with the great French general and abandoned Lithuania's capital city to Napoleon.
The advance guard rode gloriously into Vilnius. They were a Polish regiment, and all the ladies were at the windows waving their handkerchiefs and displaying national colours.
Our entry was a triumph, and shouts of joy kept ringing out.
Les Lituaniens, qui faisaient partie de cet ancien royaume de Pologne,
The Lithuanians, who were part of the former Kingdom of Poland, always thought that there would be somebody who could re-establish an independent Poland. So quite a few people hoped for this and believed me to be their liberator.
qui me croyaient, qui me considéraient comme leur libérateur.
Napoleon had taken Vilnius, but it was a hollow victory. The Tsar did not sue for peace, but simply ordered a retreat. So Napoleon resumed his long march east, in the full heat of summer, down the Smolensk road into White Russia and towards Moscow. He moved swiftly and with apparent success, but all was not as it seemed. As the Russians retreated, their peasants burnt the land that should have provided the French army with food. The first signs of hunger set in.
Having got himself going with his huge host, he couldn't stop and say, well, I don't think so, we'll go home now. That would be the end of his glory, his prestige, his power. So he had to go on, and there was nothing to eat, and they got deeper and deeper into Russia, further and further away from their supplies.
As the Russians drew the enemy into their vast, empty land, food supplies dwindled further. A time bomb was ticking for Napoleon and 500,000 men. Day 2 of the excavations, and the personal details of some of those men are starting to come to light.
So here is the button with the number 2, it's the regiment number, and we know that only Napoleon's army had the numbers of the regiments on their uniform. It's an infantry regiment, and most probably this button is from the officer's uniform.
Taken to the National Museum, this button and other artifacts found later are being cleaned and reconstructed into their original shapes.
This is a part of uniform, and here you can see 2 rows of buttons. It's probably from the jacket. This hat belonged to officer. It was found in a very bad condition. It was all pressed. I don't know if you can see that in the photos.
Illustrations are used for reference to help piece together the fragments found.
This is a fragment of front of a hat, and here you can see the number of regiment. This is the number 21, and with a rosette on the top, and eagle on the shield plate.
That is his red, white, and blue cockade, which was the most sacred object, really. It identified all these thousands of people. And that he might have been a grenadier because there is a grenade there. The 21st, well, he would have been marched into Russia at the end of June or beginning of July beside the Italian regiment. This man might have been a veteran, for all we know, of at least 30 years old, perhaps. But this one here is quite a different story. Those are the sleeve buttons of a soldier of the 29th line. This man was almost certainly an 18-year-old because that regiment, the 29th, had been almost wiped out a few years before, and in 1812 it consisted almost entirely of recruits.
As more bodies are unearthed, Riemann has his job of cataloguing and analysing them as becoming daunting. Here he will begin to piece together evidence which tells intricate and intimate stories of individual lives.
This is a skull of this young male, showing that areas of his skull are still not fused, they're still open, so we estimate he was about 20 to 25 years. And most fascinating find for us was when you put together his teeth, his jaws, so you could see the defect on his front teeth. So teeth were heavily worn in this area, and we think it's a proof of his habit. So he loved to smoke his pipe.
And smoking wasn't the only vice indulged in by the Grand Army.
Sources from our medical faculty say that up to 80% of soldiers were infected with venereal disease. It could be, of course, syphilis, it could be gonorrhea, it could be some other diseases. So this is a fragment of frontal bone, and these are scars from inflammation that is typical for tertiary syphilis. But such chronic inflammation didn't prevent him to be in active service.
Napoleon's Grand Army had travelled more than 500 miles to the tiny village of Borodino, a few days' march from Moscow, before it was forced to stop. It was here that the Russian general Kutuzov at last accepted that he must give battle if he was to save the sacred capital from capture. The Battle of Borodino, fought on a hot, dusty day on September the 7th, was an epic bloodbath. The French lost 30,000 men, while the Russians lost 43,000. Such is the significance of Borodino in the mythology of Russia that every year they reenact it.
Both sides have always claimed that they won the Battle of Borodino. But if Napoleon's purpose was to finally smash the Russian army, he failed. So he lost the battle. And if the Russians' idea was to stop the French getting into Moscow, they failed. So, in fact, it was an enormous loss of life to actually no purpose at all.
Another organizer of the battle reconstructions Pavel Timofeyev, has studied the life of Kutuzov for decades, memorizing the world-weary general's speeches which Tolstoy used in War and Peace. Kutuzov understood full well the cost of Borodino.
Any war is a heavy burden for any man, any country. And today you can't judge the war of 1812 as anybody's triumph. In war, everyone loses.
While the Russian army may not have been destroyed, Kutuzov knew that he was not ready to fight another battle. Again, he had to retreat. Moscow, the sacred capital, must be abandoned. Napoleon was expecting a fulsome greeting from a humbled Russian nobility, to whom he would offer his imperial condescension. But a shock lay in store.
Here they were prepared to march gloriously into a captured capital, as they had in all the capitals of Europe, and they found this one absolutely empty. Nobody comes to surrender the city to him. He looked very vexed and annoyed by that. Several of them describe it as if they'd walked into the Arabian Nights.
We could not understand this total silence, and we imagined that the inhabitants were peeping at us from behind the shutters.
La ville était déserte.
The city was deserted. It was frightening because there was no one in the streets, apart from a few criminals and lost dogs.
Par quelques chiens perdus qui erraient dans la rue.
But worse was yet to come. Next day, Moscow became an inferno. Its governor Rostopchin scored a masterstroke by releasing the city's criminals and lunatics, charging them to set light to the wooden city, again burning Napoleon's possible sources of food.
Parce que ce que nous a complètement mis hors de la selle,
What completely knocked us off our balance was the fire of Moscow, which sowed indiscipline and made the army lose its moral backbone.
cette colonne vertèbre morale.
There they were with a burnt-out city. Napoleon was sure even so that the Tsar must make peace. Not a bit of it. My campaign is just beginning, said the Tsar.
The Russian spirit, understood by no one, never studied by anyone. The spirit of the Russian man who is beaten, but he gets up and goes on fighting, goes to defend his motherland. And besides himself, saves many others. Thanks. Great thanks to the Russian people.
Napoleon was at a crossroads. He was not the glorious conqueror of Russia, but the emperor of a ruined ghost town, fruitlessly waiting for a capitulation that would never come. Furthermore, he had squandered the last warm days of October. With no apparent choice, and winter approaching, he turned for home. On October the 19th, Napoleon's by now severely undernourished army, already reduced to less than half its size, began the retreat back along the very road that they had come, passing the grisly spectacle of their decomposing comrades left to rot at Borodino, and through a landscape that would offer almost no food for over 700 miles before sanctuary in Vilnius. In November, the temperature began to fall. The winter of 1812 would be no ordinary winter, as the Grand Army would discover. The tables were turned. The hunter became the hunted. Day 3, and now, in order to record the exact positions in which the bodies are found, the archaeologists are beginning to sketch and measure.
Now, try to lift his vertebral columns. Here it comes.
As Rimontas removes the bodies, New details are emerging that graphically illustrate the strain placed by constant marching.
This is fragments of vertebral column of the spine bones, vertebrae of the young male. That's, well, approximately 25 years of age. And you could see these compression fractures. So this is a proof that during their marching, they had heavy loads on their backs, and the backs were quite pressed.
The soldiers' feet provide the most telling evidence.
This is left foot, and here I have metatarsal bones, or bones of feet, and here are 3 of them, like in order, and this one shows a healed fracture here. It was broken, and it was healed. Such fractures happen when person is participating in long marches, from overloading his food. Recently, it happens to sportsmen from heavy strain. Usually for young soldiers, they are still not adapted for such a big physical strains. So it could happen at any time on his way back from Moscow.
Surprisingly few items of clothing or artifacts are turning up. But today, something new is found.
Now the skeleton is being cleaned. We can observe that there are some pieces of the uniform left. It's leather pieces with their buttons. And maybe we shall find out the shape and the form and the material of this piece of the uniform.
Here we have 3 fragments of gaiters. The gaiters were worn over the knee and was fastened with a strap.
At the site, another part of the same soldier's uniform is discovered and cleaned.
This is an ornamental pocket of somebody in the 123rd line. He was certainly a Dutchman. That was a Dutch regiment. There were many Dutch regiments in the army, and he was in one of them.
More evidence about the national makeup of Napoleon's army emerges after the bones and teeth of 8 people found at the dig have been examined. Using cutting-edge technology, these tests reveal dietary changes during the soldiers' lives.
This individual, this just piece of femur, now we can say exactly that he was a northerner. He spent the beginning of his life in northern and central Europe. This one even could be more or less local, maybe from Poland, maybe even from Lithuania. The same like this individual. And this one, he was different. He was born in somewhere in South Europe, maybe somewhere in Mediterranean, and moved to Northern Europe sometime after his childhood, maybe just a few weeks before the campaign. This is just one more proof that that was really the great army from all over Europe.
Throughout November, as Napoleon's army retreated, it began to fragment, so that small bands of Russian partisans, using the tactics of guerrilla warfare in its infancy, could easily pick off bands of stragglers. Russian peasants living near these ambushes joined in to help the Russian soldiers. As one military man present remembered,
"The peasants of the village in which we now are have wreaked dreadful vengeance on many of the enemy. 50 were seized here and buried alive.
Здесь надо посмотреть по-другому. Русский защищал свой дом.
Look at it from a different angle. The Russian was defending his home. The enemy came to his home as a conqueror, robber, and violator of Russian culture. Treating our churches like stables was entertainment for Napoleon's degenerate rabble.
Могли позволить себе делать из храмов Божьих конюшни.
Of all Napoleon's miscalculations in Russia, one best revealed his fatal combination of ignorance and arrogance. His refusal to listen to repeated warnings about the Russian winter.
People kept warning him about how cold it can be in Russia in the winter, and he just brushed it aside. The weather is no worse here than it is in Fontainebleau.
The winter of 1812 turned out to be one of the 3 coldest winters ever recorded, with temperatures regularly hitting minus 35 degrees.
One of the writers says that the very air seemed frozen. From that time on, it became absolutely intolerable. People were just dropping dead as they went along, more or less.
Yesterday, I saw 4 men grouped together, hands and legs frozen, minds yet vigorous, and 2 dogs tearing their feet.
The next morning, we saw that the snow had been blown off the bank and had revealed 13 dead soldiers, piled one on top of the other and frozen solid. Some had outstretched hands, as though still imploring help from passers-by, and had obviously died in convulsive fits. "They are beckoning us," remarked one of my companions in misfortune. "Do not worry, we shall be joining you soon."
However, it was a brief lessening of the cold which proved treacherous for Napoleon on November the 27th, when the Berezina River in White Russia thawed, and the army was forced to build makeshift bridges. 3 Russian armies moved in for the kill, to the dismay of the collaborators from the Russian territories accompanying Napoleon.
When the last French troops went across and they had to blow the little bridges up to keep the Russians off, there was still 20,000 people on the other bank. One of the survivors who got across to the western side and could see what was going on from some high ground there would never forget for the rest of his life the scream of despair that went up from the eastern bank.
Collaborators were part of the forgotten Napoleonic war machine. Findings from day 3 reveal another.
So this is female, because I have a fragment of her pelvic bone, and this greater sciatic notch is more typical of females. There were women in the army, washerwomen, tradeswomen, cooks. So we got at least 27 remains of women in army. And, well, they are seldom mentioned, but they are mentioned also in the historical sources.
This one here comes from the skeleton of a woman. She was wearing a jacket with the buttons of the 61st line. But of course everybody was wearing anything they could wear to keep the cold out. It could be part of the relics of Marie-Louise Chalmet, who is the wife of a French hotelier in Moscow, who escaped, like many other French residents did, actresses and others, with the army, with her children, all the way back to Vilnius, and we know that she died here of typhus.
Surgeon Heinrich von Roos, working with Napoleon's army, remembered one woman's suffering on the last desperate push towards Vilnius.
A beautiful lady of 25 on a horse, wife of a French colonel who'd been killed a few days ago. Indifferent to everything that was going on around her, she seemed to devote all her attention to her daughter, a very beautiful child of 4, whom she was holding in front of herself. A grim despair seemed to overcome her, and almost instantly, her horse was hit by a bullet, another shattering her left thigh above the knee. At one instant, I heard her say, "Oh God, how unhappy I am, not even to be able to pray." With the calm of silent despair, she took her dying child, and with her blood-stained skirt, she strangled the poor little girl. Then, pressing her to herself, she reached her end without uttering another word.
By the beginning of December, those of the Grand Army who made it out of White Russia were again on Lithuanian soil. A brief respite, but the Russian-hating peasantry were friendlier to them. Some of Napoleon's soldiers were even taken into local villages and settled there. Today, descendants of those men still live in the villages near the border, like Bogdan Kamelugui.
Well, I know it from my father's stories, that my distant grandfather separated from the main army and stayed behind. Then this largish group divided into smaller groups, and my great-great-great-grandfather remained with his friend, the two of them. His friend was very sick, and after a while, grandfather's friend had died. So my distant grandfather was left alone in this area. He worked for food, and thus he survived. After a while, he summoned his wife from France, and she came here. Our surname's unusual in these parts, but we didn't hide it, so everyone knew that we were French. And sometimes when my neighbor's angry with me, he calls me French. But we're proud of it.
Another survivor was Louis Panabel, who lived in this house close to Bogdan's ancestor. Today, Natalia Antonova lives there.
Господин Людвиг Панабель был офицер армии Наполеона.
Mr. Ludwig Panabel was an officer in Napoleon's army. He was wounded and found himself in these parts when the army retreated from Moscow. Frostbitten and exhausted, he somehow found himself on this estate, Mereshignovsky. On the estate lived its owner. She was a young and beautiful widow. And she and Panabel saw each other and fell in love at first sight.
In 1840, Natalia's great-great-great-grandfather bought the estate from Monsieur Panabel, who returned with his wife to France.
When Mr. Panabel arrived at Mereshignovsky, together with him were several soldiers from Napoleon's army. They were also sick and wounded, and they were also treated. And when they recovered, to show their gratitude, they decided to make a set of furniture for the mistress of the house. Here is a sofa. This table was also made by French soldiers from Napoleon's army who found shelter on the estate. Stories about Napoleon I know from my earliest childhood. My grandmother liked very much to take me when I was small to a place, the French Forest it was called. Why was it called the French Forest? Because there, according to the legend, soldiers from Napoleon's retreating army were buried. Look, Bogdan, how clear it still is, that on every mound were placed stones, a gravestone. I think that when those poor and unfortunate soldiers of Napoleon's army fled through these hills, having escaped from Berezino, they died on that road over there, and local people brought their bodies to this place. And along here there were graves. It's a French cemetery. Let's pay our respects to those who lie in this place.
The dead may have been the lucky ones, for by the beginning of December, famine had driven many of Napoleon's soldiers to break the ultimate human taboo.
Many were employed in making a meal of their comrades' remains, peeling off the charred flesh with their fingers.
The last lap was in many ways the worst, and the men were just staggering on in a column which was getting ever thinner as men fell aside into the ditches, collapsed in the snow, died on the spot. And they staggered into Vilnius, and they all tried to get in through one gate. And there was the most terrible pile-up. There was a heap of writhing bodies 2 meters deep, a quivering mountain of humankind. And a lot of these bones are certainly from soldiers who died outside the gate of Vilnius.
Vilnius did not prove the sanctuary they had craved for 700 desperate miles. It was a city overflowing with those dying from typhus, gangrene, and fatigue.
The monasteries of the town had all been turned into, in inverted commas, hospitals. The dead were usually thrown out of the windows, and one observer saw corpses frozen hard, piled up even to the 3rd story.
Churches like the Dominican monastery began to fill up with the bodies of dead and dying soldiers. Rimantas is accompanying tour guide Jurati Bisigiskiene, who believes the local folklore, which says the bodies in the vaults are from 1812.
Backside from presbytery. For me, first time I'm entering through the church.
It's so dark.
Watch your steps.
No one could stay in these halls without fumigating them, so fetid was the air. The floors were covered with the intestinal evacuations of our unhappy compatriots, dying there in great numbers.
Now we are going back to the past.
Well, let's go to see those coffins. Well, yes. So these are piles of coffins. History says that Dominican monastery just above, it was used like a military hospital in 1812 by French army, and that they were dumping some of their dead patients into these cellars.
The winter of 1812 was very cold, about minus 30 degrees, so then a lot of people were dying, and it was very difficult to dig the ground. It was too hard. That is why many bodies were just thrown down to the basements. And I think among those scalps, you can recognize Napoleon soldiers.
In Vilnius, the long-imagined haven, every last semblance of order was breaking down. Fear of illness and the imminent arrival of the Russians produced panic. The locals, so welcoming 4 months earlier, bolted their doors whilst their former friends froze to death on their very doorsteps.
No one was any longer bothering about anything except their own safety. The mayor of the city, the police commissary, and the principal civil authorities were abandoning their functions and fleeing the country.
And the soldiers were left to the unrelenting cold and to the Cossacks, now closing fast on the city. It's day 4, and still almost no personal possessions have yet been discovered.
According to the historical data, the Napoleon army soldiers took the uniforms from the dead corpses because it was very cold. So it's very difficult to expect that somebody is lying there with a full uniform, with a nice hat and nice shoes and well-preserved gun or something like that. And we know that the local people expected to find gold. I know that they were taking off the buttons, looking for precious metals inside.
This left shin bone shows clear signs of sharp instrument, like cutting wound, with a blow from above and going down. And as there were almost no remains of shoes, My suggestion is this could happen during looting, just trying to remove shoes from frozen body.
The instinct to survive drove the Lithuanians to extremes.
Many of the bodies had missing toes, the result of someone tearing off frozen shoes. Sometimes the pillagers did not even wait for the victims to utter their final breath before stripping them.
Given that the ground would have been frozen solid in the winter of 1812, the archaeologists were at first mystified about how the ditch which came to hold the bodies was created. On day 4 of the dig, a new explanation is emerging.
We thought at first that it's some natural ditch or trench where these people were put, but we are thinking now that most probably it's some fortification, and Napoleon fortified this place in June 1812.
Recent study of the records shows that the Russians ordered that more than 7,000 people were to be buried in a pit which Napoleon's men had dug earlier in the summer of that year.
It's a tragedy for these young people that found their death here, and we can say in some sense that they dug their own grave.
Napoleon's army was facing annihilation, and at this critical moment, the emperor took an extraordinary decision. He abandoned Vilnius and his men. He instructed one of his commanders, Marshal Murat, to defend the city. He was unable to. The Russians recaptured it by December the 10th. With more than 95% of his army dead, Napoleon's days as emperor were numbered, and he was soon to be exiled to Elba. The Russian campaign had destroyed his fighting force irretrievably, and so Napoleon's brief escapade at Waterloo in 1815 could never have been more than a brave but futile last adventure. Those he had abandoned in Vilnius now awaited the arrival of the avenging Cossacks. The fractures found by Riemantas on the bones immediately begged the question of how they happened. Were local stories about vengeful Russians right?
One of our principal duties was to establish the causes of their death. Did they die in combat or they died from other causes? And we have total absence of mortal combat wounds. And majority of fractures happened most probably after the death, when the bodies were being collected from streets of the city, being thrown into carriages or sledges and being thrown into the pits. So concerning the real causes of death of these people, archaeological evidence shows they were dying from cold, from exhaustion, and from starvation.
It has long been believed that the rump of the Grand Army met its end at Russian hands, but by the final day, the bones are revealing a different story. What the Vilnius dig has established beyond doubt is that when the Russians took Vilnius, there was no army left to kill. Their work had been done for them by the French Emperor himself. On day 5, Bogdan Kamalubui has come to the mass grave to see the remains of his great-great-great-grandfather's comrades.
Looking at these bones, I recall my distant grandfather, who was also a soldier in the French army. I think that if he hadn't stayed behind, if he hadn't left the core of the army, it is possible that he would be among these bones as well. However, he was buried in a somewhat different manner from these people. Not in a common grave. He was buried in a Christian way with a priest and rests in a Catholic cemetery.
Day 5 of the excavations is Friday the 13th of September, but events at the dig prove it to be a lucky day.
It's a really amazing find. This is a Louis XVI coin from year 1786. And all the day long, our students was saying that today something must happen because it's Friday the 13th. So really something happened. Unfortunately, this golden coin didn't save the life of the person that possessed it.
Last weeks of their life was just, I would say, full of a horror. Just imagine yourself, just a young guy, being in absolutely hostile surroundings, hostile climate, with vast distances, enormous woods around, hungry and starving, and seeing no way to escape. That was really terrible. That was really horrifying. So this is, I would say, just a story of horror.
At last, after lying in an unmarked grave for nearly 200 years, the bones of these men and women will be given a proper burial this spring, alongside the victims of other wars in the Antakalina War Cemetery in Vilnius.
Their memory will live here forever and will remain in the hearts of the French people.
Je voudrais leur dire, soldats, vous êtes tombés.
I'd like to say to them, soldiers, you fell on the field of honor, and your emperor, France and Europe will always remember your sacrifice. And I would like to die like you on the field of honor for my country and for Europe. Thank you, brave men.
They were fulfilling their duty. They died, and these people could be of various nationalities, well, I don't know, and finally I don't care, but all of them died for some idea. They fulfilled their duties. They died for a French flag. So it's important for these people to be buried properly.
So, Napoleon Bonaparte, the deserter of Egypt, is deserting Russia, abandoning us to our wretched lot and to all the follies of an adventurer who would have been the world's biggest lunatic if he hadn't been its emperor.
In May 1952, the passengers of a British airliner were subjected to an ordeal which all air travelers dread. Lost, out of fuel, they were forced to crash land in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. 50 years later, an expedition traveled deep into the Sahara Desert to find what is left of Flight 251.